In 1901, Andrew Carnegie sold his steel company for $480 million. It was the largest business deal in American history. He had started with nothing, no money, no education, no family connections, just a one-room cottage in Scotland and a boat ticket to America. What happened in between is a story about how far one person can go and what they are willing to do to get there. Let us go back to 1835, when a young boy was born into poverty. Andrew Carnegie was born on November 25, 1835, in Dunfermline, Scotland. The house he grew up in had one main room that his family shared with another family. His father, William Carnegie, was a damask weaver, a man who made cloth by hand on a loom. It was skilled work, and it had supported the family for years. Then, the Industrial Revolution reached Scotland. Steam-powered looms began replacing hand weavers across the country. Mills could produce cloth faster and cheaper than any individual weaver, and the old trade became unnecessary almost overnight. By the late 1840s, William Carnegie had no steady work and no reliable income. Andrew's mother, Margaret, took on whatever she could find, repairing shoes for people in the area to keep the family fed. Andrew watched his father search for work and find almost nothing. It was an image that stayed with him for the rest of his life. By 1848, it was clear there was no future for the family in Scotland. Margaret had sisters in America who wrote back about opportunities in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The family sold everything they owned, bought boat tickets, and left Scotland for good. Andrew was 12 years old. Pittsburgh was a manufacturing city with iron foundries, glass factories, and a growing railroad network. But when the Carnegies arrived, both parents struggled to find consistent work. Andrew made a decision quickly. He left school after 5 years of education and went to work. In 1848, he started at a local cotton mill, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for $1.20 per week. He was later promoted to engineer's assistant, stoking the boilers that powered the mill. The job paid slightly more, but gave him nightmares. He would wake in a sweat, convinced something had gone wrong at the factory. By 1850, at age 14, he found a better position. A local telegraph office needed a messenger boy to deliver telegrams across Pittsburgh at $2.50 a week. Carnegie took it without hesitation. Most messenger boys delivered their telegrams and went home. Carnegie paid attention to everything around him. He memorized the names and faces of every businessman he delivered to, every manager, every owner, every person of influence in the city. If he saw them again on the street, he greeted them by name. Over time, people noticed. He was quick, reliable, and clearly thinking about more than just his deliveries. In 1853, that habit produced a result. Thomas Scott, the regional manager of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the largest railroad company in the country, offered Carnegie a job as his personal telegrapher and private secretary. Carnegie was 17. His pay jumped to $35 a month. Scott was experienced, well-connected, and rising fast within the company. He took a genuine interest in Carnegie and began teaching him how a large organization operated, how decisions were made, how costs were managed, how people were handled. He called Carnegie "my boy Andy." Working directly alongside Scott gave Carnegie something no mill or telegraph office could have provided: a close view of how the people running a major business actually thought. In 1855, William Carnegie died at age 51. He had never found steady work after leaving Scotland. Andrew came home to find his mother in tears and made her a promise he would become wealthy and take care of her. He was 19 years old. He had no clear plan yet, but he had spent 7 years watching how business worked from the inside, and he had a very clear memory of what it looked like to have nothing. By 1859, Carnegie had been working alongside Thomas Scott at the Pennsylvania Railroad for 6 years. Scott had been promoted to vice president, and Carnegie had moved up with him, taking over Scott's old role as superintendent of the Western Division. He was 23 years old, and managing hundreds of workers and miles of track, but he was also watching something else closely. The railroad business had shown him how large organizations moved money, managed supply chains, and controlled costs. He had seen which companies made real money, and which ones just looked like they did, and he had begun making small investments on the side, putting money into companies he believed in and collecting returns. In 1859, oil was discovered in Pennsylvania, and the rush that followed created immediate demand for iron bridges, pipelines, and railroad infrastructure. Carnegie saw the opportunity clearly. Iron was the material that made expansion possible, and the people supplying it were making steady money regardless of what happened in any other industry. In 1865, Carnegie left the Pennsylvania Railroad and moved to New York with his mother. He was 29 years old, and he had saved enough from his railroad salary and his investments to go into business for himself. He started with the Keystone Bridge Company, which built iron bridges to replace the aging wooden structures across the country. His railroad connections brought him customers immediately, and the business grew fast. From the beginning, Carnegie applied one principle to every business he touched: control the supply chain. Instead of buying iron from outside suppliers, he built his own iron mills. Instead of hiring outside contractors, he brought the work in-house. Every step he could own, he owned. This kept his costs low and gave him a quality advantage over competitors who depended on outside suppliers. By the early 1870s, Carnegie was running several connected businesses and earning more than most men twice his age, but he was thinking bigger than iron. In 1872, he traveled to England and visited Henry Bessemer's steel mill. The Bessemer converter was a new technology that could turn raw iron into steel in 15 minutes, a process that previously took weeks. Steel was stronger than iron, more versatile, and with the Bessemer process, it could now be produced cheaply enough to use at scale. Carnegie came back from England convinced that steel was the future. He invested nearly everything he had in building a new steel mill outside Pittsburgh. He named it the Edgar Thomson Steel Works, after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, ensuring that his best potential customer felt personally connected to the mill before it had produced a single rail. The mill opened in 1875. Within its first year, it had produced more steel rail than any other facility in the country. Carnegie ran the mill the way he had run everything else: watch the costs, and the profits will follow. He kept detailed records of every part of the production process, constantly looking for steps that could be made faster or cheaper. When new machinery became available that could replace a manual process, he bought it. When a competitor found a more efficient method, he studied it and adopted it. He also chose his managers carefully. Carnegie had no interest in hiring people who simply followed instructions. He wanted people who could find problems he had not noticed yet, and he paid them accordingly. He created profit-sharing arrangements with his top managers, giving them a stake in the company's performance. They worked like owners, because in some cases they were. By the late 1870s, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel at a lower cost than any competitor in the country. Prices for steel rail fell significantly, which accelerated the expansion of the American railroad network and created even more demand for Carnegie's product. By the 1880s, John D. Rockefeller, who had built his own empire in oil during the same period, had taken notice of Carnegie the way Carnegie had taken notice of him. Two men who had both started with nothing were now running the two largest industrial operations in the country. They watched each other's moves carefully, operated in parallel industries, and understood each other's methods better than most people around them did. By 1889, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel annually than the entire country of Great Britain. Carnegie was 53 years old. He had built the most productive steel operation in the world, and he was not finished expanding it. But the same drive that had taken him from a cotton mill to the top of American industry was about to create a problem he could not easily walk away from. To keep Carnegie Steel growing at the pace Carnegie demanded, he needed someone who could run the day-to-day operations without hesitation. In 1881, he brought in Henry Clay Frick as a partner and eventually chairman of Carnegie Steel. Frick was a self-made man who had built a coal business in Pennsylvania. Through relentless cost-cutting and hard negotiating, he was exactly what Carnegie needed operationally. And the two men understood each other well in the beginning. Frick's approach to running the mills was straightforward. Keep production high, keep costs low, and do not let anything slow the operation down. Workers at Carnegie Steel put in 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, with one holiday per year. The pay was tied to the price of steel, which meant when steel prices fell, wages fell with them. By 1892, steel prices had been falling for several years, and wages at the Homestead plant near Pittsburgh had dropped accordingly. That year, when the workers' union contract came up for renewal, Frick offered terms that would reduce wages further and effectively dissolved the union's ability to negotiate future contracts. The workers refused and went on strike, barricading themselves inside the plant to prevent it from operating. Carnegie was in Scotland when the strike began. He had left Frick in charge and was publicly unreachable, though he was privately writing to Frick confirming his support for the position they had taken. Frick moved quickly. He hired 300 Pinkerton agents, private security men, to escort a new group of replacement workers into the plant by barge on the Monongahela River. On July 6, 1892, the barges arrived before dawn. The striking workers were waiting on the riverbank. What followed lasted 12 hours. When it ended, 9 workers and 7 Pinkerton agents were dead. The Pinkertons surrendered and were escorted out of the area. The confrontation was front-page news across the country. Public reaction was immediate and severe. Carnegie, who had written publicly about the rights of workers and the importance of treating employees fairly, was now connected to an event that had left 16 people dead and hundreds of families without income. The Pennsylvania State Militia arrived days later with 8,000 soldiers and took control of the plant. Replacement workers moved in and the mill resumed production. The original workers lost their jobs. Many lost their homes. The union was effectively finished at Homestead, and no steelworkers union would return to Carnegie's mills for the next 45 years. Carnegie returned from Scotland and attempted to distance himself from the decisions Frick had made. Frick had no interest in being used that way. He had acted with Carnegie's full knowledge and support, and he made that clear privately. Their relationship deteriorated steadily from that point. In 1900, Frick resigned from Carnegie Steel following a dispute over the value of his shares in the company. He sued Carnegie and eventually settled for $31 million. The two men never spoke again. What the Homestead strike did to Carnegie's public image was permanent. He had built a reputation as a man who understood working people, because he had been one. That reputation did not survive 1892. What remained was a more complicated picture, a man who genuinely believed in opportunity and education, but who had also been willing to let others pay the cost of keeping his business growing. He was 56 years old and the richest steel producer in the world, and he had begun to think seriously about what he was going to do with what he had built. Despite the fallout from Homestead, Carnegie Steel kept growing through the 1890s. New mills opened, production increased, and the demand for steel continued to rise as American cities expanded upward and outward. By 1900, Carnegie Steel was generating around $40 million in profit per year. Carnegie was 64 years old. His wife Louise had been asking him for years to step back. He had written himself a note at age 33, a private reminder that accumulating money was not the goal and that he intended to spend the second half of his life doing something more useful with it. He was now 3 decades past that self-imposed deadline. The opportunity to stop came from J.P. Morgan. Morgan was a financier who had spent years consolidating American railroads and banks into larger, more stable organizations. By the late 1890s, he had turned his attention to steel. He believed the industry needed to be organized under one structure, and he wanted Carnegie's mills at the center of it. In early 1901, a broker approached Carnegie on Morgan's behalf. Carnegie's wife had quietly advised the broker to raise the subject when Carnegie was relaxed. The conversation happened on a golf course. Carnegie thought about it overnight, and the next morning wrote a number on a piece of paper: $480 million. The broker brought it to Morgan, who looked at it and agreed immediately without a single counter-offer. When the two men met to finalize the deal, Carnegie told Morgan he thought he could have asked for $100 million more. Morgan looked at him and said he would have paid it. Morgan combined Carnegie Steel with several other companies to form U.S. Steel, which became the first corporation in American history, valued at over $1 billion. Carnegie walked away as the richest private individual in the world. He never ran a business again. Within weeks of the sale closing, Carnegie realized a harsh truth. The fortune was now so large that giving it away would require the same ruthless organization that building it had. He had strong views on how money should be given. He did not believe in handing cash directly to individuals. He believed the most lasting thing money could do was give people access to knowledge and education, tools they could use to improve their own position. Gifts that did the work once and stopped were less interesting to him than institutions that kept doing the work long after the money was spent. He began with libraries. Carnegie funded the construction of 2,500 public libraries across the United States, Britain, Canada, and beyond. His only condition was that the local government had to agree to fund the library's ongoing operations. He would build it, they would run it. By the time he was done, more public libraries existed in the English-speaking world than at any previous point in history. In 1895, he had already donated the money to build Carnegie Hall in New York City, which became one of the most recognized concert venues in the world. In 1900, he funded the Carnegie Technical Schools in Pittsburgh, which later became Carnegie Mellon University. In 1902, he established the Carnegie Institution of Washington to fund scientific research. In 1904, the Carnegie Hero Fund to recognize acts of civilian bravery. In 1905, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, which eventually created the pension system for university professors across America. He also wrote and published an essay called The Gospel of Wealth, in which he argued that a man who dies rich dies disgraced. His position was direct. Wealthy men had an obligation to give their money away during their own lifetime, not leave it to their children or let it sit in a family estate. He believed that a man who had learned how to build wealth was also the best person to decide where it would do the most good. Rockefeller, who was doing the same thing in parallel through the Rockefeller Foundation and the University of Chicago, read Carnegie's essay and broadly agreed with its conclusions. Two men who had built parallel empires were now dismantling them in parallel as well. By the time Carnegie died on August 11, 1919, he had given away over $350 million. The Carnegie Corporation, which he had set up to continue the work after his death, distributed the remainder of his estate. He gave away over 90% of everything he ever made. Andrew Carnegie died on August 11, 1919. He had been born into a Scotland that was running out of work for people like his father, and he died in a world that his steel had helped build. What he left behind sits on both sides of the same ledger. On one side, the record is straightforward. Carnegie Steel drove down the cost of producing steel so significantly that the railroads, bridges, and skyscrapers that defined modern America became financially possible. Before Carnegie, large-scale steel construction was expensive and slow. After him, it was neither. The infrastructure of an entire nation changed because of the efficiency he built into one industry. The libraries he funded are still open. The universities he built are still running. The Carnegie Corporation is still operating today, more than 100 years after he set it up. The institutions he created were designed to outlast him, and they have. On the other side, the record is equally clear. The workers who built Carnegie Steel did so under conditions that Carnegie controlled and rarely questioned. Wages fell when it suited the business. Hours were long and the work was dangerous. When the workers at Homestead pushed back in 1892, Carnegie supported the decision to bring in armed men rather than negotiate. 16 people died. Hundreds of families lost their income. The Union was gone for 45 years. Carnegie spent years after Homestead trying to reconcile those two sides of his own story. He wrote about the obligations of wealth. He gave away more money than almost anyone in history, but he never fully acknowledged what had happened at Homestead in public. And the people who lost their jobs that summer did not get them back. Both sides of that record belong to the same man. The same focus that made his mills more efficient than any competitor also made him willing to hold his position at Homestead regardless of the cost. The same belief in education and self-improvement that drove him out of Scotland and into the telegraph office drove him to build libraries in towns that had never had one. There was not a generous Carnegie and a hard Carnegie. There was one person, consistent throughout, who produced very different results depending on which side of his business you were standing on. People have been arguing about how to read that ever since. What is harder to argue with is the scale of what he built and what he gave. He arrived in America at 12 years old, with 5 years of schooling and no money. He left behind institutions that educated millions of people who never knew his name. And then there is the final chapter of his relationship with Henry Clay Frick. In his last years, Carnegie reached out to Frick. The two men had not spoken since the lawsuit nearly 2 decades earlier. Carnegie sent a message suggesting it was time to put the past behind them and meet before it was too late. Frick read the letter, looked at the messenger, and gave his reply. Yes, you can tell Carnegie I will meet him. He crumpled the paper and tossed it away. Tell him I will meet him in hell, because that is where we are both going.